Senator JD Vance thought he had Representative Jasmine Crockett cornered with a calculated political attack. But what he received instead was a devastating dose of truth he wasn't prepared to handle. The hearing room carried that particular tension that emerges when cameras roll and every statement might become tomorrow's breaking news. Federal housing reform filled the official agenda, but for many present, this wasn't about policy, it was about power dynamics and territorial claims. When Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone and leaned forward, she understood exactly what kind of environment she'd entered. Across the table sat Senator JD Vance, hair perfectly styled, tie deliberately loosened, wearing that confident posture politicians adopt when they believe they're the most intelligent person present. Vance remained silent initially, but his gaze tracked Crockett like a predator awaiting the perfect moment to strike. Crockett refused to provide that opening. She'd arrived prepared, binder packed with evidence, but more importantly, armed with stories, names, faces of people who would never receive invitations to such proceedings. She'd flown from Dallas the previous evening, reviewing policy documents during the flight, skipping the traditional staff dinner. None of that preparation mattered. Now this was showtime. Representative Barry Granger from Oregon was discussing modular housing initiatives when Vance began shifting restlessly, clearly preparing for something different. While Granger rambled about innovation funding, Vance's attention remained fixed on Crockett. When Granger concluded, Vance immediately requested recognition. "Madam Chair," he said smoothly, "I'd like to address Representative Crockett directly." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Cameras pivoted, staffers turned their heads, and attention focused squarely on this brewing confrontation. Vance maintained his measured tone. "You've advocated for increased federal housing funds to address conditions in cities like Dallas. But how do you justify that when so many urban areas face violence, mismanagement, and persistent homelessness undercurrent? Leadership, would an additional federal money simply subsidize failure?" There it was, the carefully crafted attack. The words weren't shouted, but they cut deep. Designed to suggest that your people couldn't manage anything, framing cities and communities of color as fundamentally broken and wasteful. For a brief moment Crockett remained motionless. Then she reached for her water, took a measured sip, and replaced the bottle. Her expression stayed neutral, but her hand hovered over her binder. "Senator," she said steadily, "I'm grateful you asked that question." Several people in the back rows looked up. Something in her voice, low and even, didn't match the attack's intensity, but it carried undeniable weight, as if she'd been anticipating this exact question her entire career. "I represent a district where people work multiple shifts and still cannot afford rent, where schools share buildings with mold and rodents, where families cram into single rooms not by choice but by necessity. You mentioned mismanagement. I call it systematic disinvestment." She paused briefly, not for theatrical effect but for emphasis. The violence you referenced didn't materialize from nowhere. It emerged from a system that constructed highways through our neighborhoods, redlined us out of opportunities, then expressed shock when consequences appeared. Her voice didn't rise, but each word struck with the force of concrete blocks. "And regarding federal funding, Dallas contributes billions to the federal government annually. Our residents pay taxes. We're not requesting charity, we're demanding our rightful share. You want accountability? Let's examine where money actually flows." Vance shifted slightly, barely perceptible, but noticeable. Crockett caught it. She wasn't finished, but this wasn't her moment to completely flip the narrative. That was coming next. Vance gave a brief, dry chuckle, just enough to demonstrate he wasn't rattled, though his fingers tapped once against the table. He leaned forward, ready for another swing. "Well, Representative," he continued with that polished tone, "you mentioned redlining and highways, but we're into at what point do current city leaders accept responsibility for present conditions? Or are we perpetually blaming history instead of addressing today's problems?" Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't shocking, it was familiar. A politician demanding accountability, but only from one direction. The kind of statement that generates applause in friendly rooms and quiet nods elsewhere. But this wasn't one of those rooms, and Crockett wasn't one of those representatives. "You want responsibility?" she asked. "Let's have that discussion." She opened her binder and extracted a single document, small font, highlighted sections. She held it up, not for show, but to demonstrate she wasn't speaking from opinion alone. "Here's a federal report from 2022 showing that states with the highest poverty rates are overwhelmingly rural. It demonstrates that access to clean water, healthcare, and safe housing isn't exclusively an urban challenge. It's affecting Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, places like Ross County, Ohio." She looked directly at him. "That's your state, correct?" He didn't respond. He didn't need to. "You want to discuss leadership? Let's examine that. While you're questioning urban leaders, your own constituents live in trailer homes with black mold and no running water. Some lack consistent electricity, and you voted against the legislation that would have helped them." Several people raised eyebrows. One staffer scribbled notes quickly. Vance adjusted his microphone. "With all due respect, those problems are complex. We can't solve rural poverty with a single bill. And neither can we solve urban housing insecurity with one grant program, Crockett interrupted calmly but firmly. But when you question leaders' competence based on their zip codes, especially when those areas are predominantly populated by people of color, you're not offering solutions. You're avoiding your own record. She delivered it without shouting. The impact came from how quietly her voice remained. Across the room, younger aides leaned forward, trying to catch every word. On social media, live threads had already gained momentum. Someone had clipped the last 30 seconds with the caption, "Crockett didn't come to play." But this wasn't about social media. This was about people like Miss Leona in South Dallas, who'd called Crockett's office weekly for 3 months, trying to get Section 8 paperwork approved. People like Carlos, a high school junior, living in his aunt's van while completing exams. People who don't get hearings or microphones, but live with the consequences of policies written in rooms exactly like this one. Crockett reached into her folder again, this time producing a photograph. Nothing dramatic, just a 2-story house. In poor condition, peeling paint, sagging roof, blue tarp secured with bricks. She slid it forward where cameras could capture it. This is in Chillicothe, Ohio, not Dallas. A woman named Terry lives here. She's 62. Her heater broke to winter's back. She uses her oven for warmth. You know what she told a reporter last month? They always discuss big cities on the news. Nobody ever asks about us. Crockett looked at Vance again, her voice dropping slightly. People like Terry and people like Miss Leona aren't each other's enemies. But when you use hearings like this for city versus country politics, that's exactly what you create. She leaned back. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to work. But the moment that would change everything was still approaching. For several seconds, JD Vance said nothing. He shifted slightly enough to suggest discomfort without admitting it. Someone coughed several rows back. Crockett didn't move, letting the silence extend, allowing her words weight to linger longer than most politicians find comfortable. Then she leaned forward. I'm not going to pretend cities don't have problems, she said, her voice level, almost conversational. We do. But let me clarify something. Poverty isn't moral failure. It's not laziness or poor leadership. It's policy results. It's decisions made by people who never live with the consequences. She opened her folder, again organized, tabbed, color-coded. I brought data. Since people love statistics from think tanks. She tapped the pages. Let's discuss eviction rates. Dallas has among the nation's highest, certainly. But it's not because people refuse to pay, it's because wages haven't matched rent increases. Median rent in my district is $1,400. The average full-time minimum wage worker makes about $2,100 monthly. Do the math. Murmurs started in the back, not applause, just acknowledgement, people processing, calculating mentally. The room's tone began shifting, not toward her or against Vance, but toward the reality she was painting. And remember, she added, those same families still lose utilities when they fall behind. Their children still get sick from mold. When they apply for relief, they're waitlisted or denied because federal money's already diverted elsewhere, somewhere that looks nothing like them. She let that resonate briefly. I know what this appears like, Crockett continued. I've witnessed it. I've lived pieces of it. My mother cleaned houses during the day, stocked shelves at night. She didn't want pity, she wanted a roof that didn't leak and a doctor who'd see her without a 6-week wait. Her voice remained steady but carried more weight now. She wasn't reading anymore, she was remembering. I attended a public high school that failed accreditation twice. You know what our government said? We'll revisit this funding in 2 years. 2 years? That's someone's freshman and sophomore years gone. Try explaining that to parents whose children are already falling behind. Vance looked down at his notes. Crockett noticed and continued. This hearing isn't about blame, she said. It's about willpower. Whether we want to fix things or just win arguments. Because I can tell you people in my district aren't checking C-SPAN to see who scored points. They're checking if their housing voucher went through. Senator Pauline, Mark's 3 chairs down, scribbled in her notebook margins without looking up. Everyone felt the energy shifting, and Crockett wasn't nearly finished. But since we're discussing responsibility, she said, flipping a page, let's not pretend urban districts caused their own collapse. Ever heard of urban renewal programs from the 1950s and 60s? That was federal policy bold. Entire communities ran highways through black neighborhoods, relocated families without plans or support, called it progress. What followed? Generational housing instability. She leaned forward again, voice quieter now, the tone that forces people to lean in. We didn't ask for the knife, but we've been bleeding ever since. You could hear it then, the quiet of a room caught between reflection and tension. Crockett wasn't attacking. She was testifying. And Vance, for once, didn't interrupt. But what Crockett said next would put him directly on the defensive. Representative Crockett closed her binder for the first time since beginning her testimony. She didn't need it anymore. What came next wasn't from policy briefings or research papers. It came from experience and precision. You know what gets me, Senator? She asked, eyes locked on him. This narrative that poverty only looks like tall buildings, cracked sidewalks, and graffiti-covered walls. That when you see black and brown people struggling, it's poor leadership. But when it's white families in rural areas, it's a national crisis. You don't hear people saying they failed, you hear them saying the system failed. She let that sting, just long enough. I've spent time in places like Athens County and Jackson Township, she continued, naming Ohio areas most of the room probably hadn't heard of. Not for press, not for optics, but because poor is poor whether it's East Dallas or a trailer park outside Zanesville. You say urban leaders need to step up, but what about rural representation? What about your job? The words burned slowly, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and inescapable. Vance inhaled sharply and adjusted his seat. With all due respect, but she didn't stop. No, let's actually discuss respect, she said, because I'm tired of people showing up to these hearings to take cheap shots at mayors, community organizers, and single mothers, then turning around and voting against the same bills that could help people in your counties. She shifted forward, one hand gripping the microphone. I read through your voting record last night. You opposed the Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program that would have funded low-income rental rehabilitation, assisted homeless veterans in small towns, and supported transitional housing for families evicted during the pandemic. You voted no. Now she stared straight at him. You talk about how the American dream is slipping away from the heartland, but when your constituents need help paying heating bills, you blame bureaucracy. When they overdose in gas station parking lots, you blame culture. And when someone tries to find solutions, you call it government overreach. A few quiet gasps fluttered across the room. And I want to be clear, she said. I'm not weaponizing their pain, I'm acknowledging it. Because the truth is, those folks deserve better too. But if we're going to sit here and act like one version of poverty is a political liability and the other is a call to action, then we're not serious about change. We're just rehearsing bias. Vance reached for his pen, didn't write anything, then set it down. He looked toward the chairwoman as if waiting for rescue. None came. Crockett wasn't finished. I once met a man in Jackson, Ohio. Name was Ronnie. 72 years old, former steelworker, lost his pension when the company folded, lives on peanut butter, canned beans, and what's left of his Social Security check. He told me he's too proud to ask for help and too tired to fight for it. But he was clear about one thing. He didn't care what party fixed things. He just wanted to not wake up cold in February. She paused. Ronnie's story isn't different from many people I know back home, except we talk about folks like Ronnie with sympathy and folks like mine with suspicion. The hearing room wasn't tense anymore, was frozen. She leaned back and folded her hands. If we're going to build housing policy that works, she said quietly, we have to stop playing categories rural versus urban, white versus black, worthy versus dependent. Because those aren't real divisions, they're political distractions. The chairwoman didn't interrupt. No one did, but Crockett wasn't finished yet. Because now she was about to make it personal. Representative Crockett looked down momentarily, not at her binder or notes, just gathering breath. When she raised her head, the tone shifted. You could feel it. She wasn't debating anymore. She was remembering. I don't usually discuss this in hearings, she began, because the second you get personal, folks either dismiss you or try to use it against you. But today I'm going to tell you something. She leaned slightly closer to the microphone. I was 13 when we got evicted. My mother worked 6 days a week. My dad had just gotten laid off from the auto shop. One morning we came home from school and our stuff was on the lawn couch. Boxers, our TV, everything just out there like it didn't matter. My little brother thought we were moving. He didn't understand what was happening. The room had gone quiet, not polite silence, but real, heavy silence. Even Senator Vance kept his eyes on her now. We stayed with my aunt for 2 weeks, then a neighbor for 3. It was the first time I realized how fragile stability is. You think you're okay until you're not. You think your hard work guarantees safety until the notice is on your door. She took a breath. We eventually got into a small apartment. My mother never let us call it the bad side of town, she said. It's not bad, it's just ours for now. A staffer across the room slowly put her pen down. Years later, Crockett continued, I became a public defender. One of my first clients was a woman arrested for trespassing, except she wasn't trespassing. She was living in an abandoned house with her 2 kids. She cleaned office buildings at night and dropped them off at school in the morning. But technically, she had no address, so she was a criminal. She paused, not for drama, but because her throat caught briefly. I remember sitting across from her and thinking if one thing had gone differently for me, I could have been her. Same grit, same exhaustion, same fire in her eyes. No one in the room looked away. This is why I fight the way I do. This is why I show up with data and names. Because people don't live in charts, they live in neighborhoods. They live in motel rooms and bus shelters and cars that should have been junked 5 years ago. Senator Vance had gone still, his hands resting motionless on his notes. And look, I don't hate rural communities. I've driven through your counties, Senator. I've stopped at gas stations where shelves were half empty. I've seen kids walking a mile down roads to catch school buses. You think I don't recognize that pain? You think because I fight for urban housing I'm blind to that? She shook her head slowly. That's where we mess up, when we let these fake divisions keep us from seeing the truth. That poverty doesn't care what state you're in, it doesn't care who you voted for, it hits you just the same. Her voice softened, but her words stayed firm. My mom told me something after that eviction. She said, "Don't ever let them shame you for what you had to survive." That stuck with me. Because every time someone tries to humiliate a poor family or turn them into a punchline for political gain, I hear her voice. She looks straight ahead again, not at Vance, not at the panel, but at the cameras. Every time someone calls public housing a failure, I see my brother sleeping on a couch in a borrowed living room. Every time someone says people should just work harder, I think about how my mom got blisters on her feet scrubbing floors at 3 a.m. She straightened her shoulders. This isn't abstract for me. This is my story, and it's the story of millions of others who can't afford to be in this room. So if you're going to question their worthiness, you'd better be ready for someone to speak up. While that hearing room remained quiet, the outside world was already catching fire. By the time the hearing ended, the clip had reached 3 million views. It started as a 47-second video posted by a junior staffer on their personal account, just Crockett's final lines about eviction, shame, and worthiness. No flashy edits, no music, just her voice, her face, and the silence surrounding her. That silence spoke louder than most campaigns ever could. An hour later, someone from a digital outlet in Columbus reposted it with the caption, "JD Vance came for Jasmine Crockett. He wasn't ready." From there it spread like wildfire. On TikTok, younger users stitched themselves into the clip, nodding slowly as she spoke, mouths tight, eyes glassy. Others told stories of eviction, of sleeping on couches, of hiding behind curtains during police sweeps. They weren't engaging in political debate, they were remembering. On Twitter, hashtags like Crockett clap back, and she said it started trending within 2 hours. An Ohio-based housing nonprofit shared the video, adding, "We've been waiting for someone to say this out loud for years." By evening news, major anchors were quoting parts of her speech. Not one network ignored it. Some called it a takedown, others a reckoning, although every outlet had its own spin. One fact remained: Crockett had shifted the room and the conversation. Meanwhile, Vance's team worked behind the scenes to release a statement. It dropped on his official site just before midnight. "We must all strive to improve the lives of those we serve, urban, rural, and everything in between. While I may disagree with Representative Crockett's methods, I respect her passion." It was generic, safe, the kind of message that neither offends nor admits fault. But it didn't land. Comments under his post filled with screenshots of Crockett's quotes, her statistics, her personal stories. One user wrote, "She came with facts. He came with talking points." In Dallas, Crockett's office phone didn't stop ringing. People called just to say thank you. One woman left a voicemail through tears. "I never thought anyone in Congress knew what it felt like to lose your home." But it wasn't just urban residents responding. That's what surprised everyone. Messages poured in from Chillicothe, Portsmouth towns Vance had carried icily during his last campaign. One message from a veteran in rural Ohio read, "I don't agree with her politics, but everything she said about housing out here was true. We've been forgotten." Crockett sat with her staff in a narrow Dallas office 2 days later. The walls were lined with printouts and handwritten letters, some from teenage students, one from a retired pastor who'd never voted Democrat but said he'd changed his mind. Still, she didn't smile about it. "This isn't a win," she told them. "It's a reminder." Her staffer Devon looked up. "A reminder of what?" "That we shouldn't need a viral video for people to believe our stories," she said. "People should have cared when Miss Leona called my office 6 months ago. They should have cared when Ronnie's pension disappeared. The cameras weren't there." For that, someone in the back asked if they should start writing thank you responses to the letters. "We will," she said. "But we're also going to finish drafting that new housing bill. One with teeth this time." The room quieted. Outside that office, political commentators were still dissecting every frame. Analysts speculated about Crockett's future. Some wondered if she'd run statewide. Others said she was too raw, too direct for the Senate. But her focus stayed the same. There was still work to do. The deeper lesson behind all of this would come next. And it was about far more than politics. By the following week, the hype had started to fade. Headlines moved on as they always do. A tech company went under. A senator said something off-color on a podcast. But for people who really listened to what Crockett had said, the moment hadn't passed. It had stuck quietly, stubbornly in the back of their minds. Because this wasn't just about a clapback. It wasn't about a polished moment on the Hill. Happened in that hearing tapped into something deeper, something most people feel but rarely say out loud. That the fight over housing isn't just a budget issue. It's a mirror. It forces people to confront what and who they think is worth saving. It's easy to sit behind microphones and throw statistics back and forth. Easy to say personal responsibility, or pull yourself up when the conversation is abstract. But what Crockett did that day was make it personal, not just with her story, but with everyone's. Because when you strip away the noise, what she said boiled down to one hard truth. This country doesn't treat all suffering the same. A white man in rural Ohio is called forgotten. A working-class black woman in South Dallas is called a failure. One is pitied, the other blamed. That's not policy, that's bias. And that bias bleeds into every funding decision, every zoning law, every headline about who deserves help and who wasted it. Crockett's message wasn't that urban struggle deserves more sympathy than rural. It was that both deserve attention, both deserve investment, and neither should be weaponized against the other for political gain. But she also exposed something people rarely admit, that many lawmakers depend on these divisions. Because if the poor in rural Ohio start seeing themselves in the poor in South Dallas, the whole game changes. Suddenly, the questions get harder. Suddenly the people at the bottom start asking the same things and demanding real answers. And when that happens, someone's grip on power loosens. This is why moments like that hearing matter, not because they go viral, but because they pull back the curtain. They show who's willing to speak when it's inconvenient, who's ready to be uncomfortable, who's willing to put truth above optics. There's a scene people don't talk about much that happened the day after the hearing. Crockett was flying home, sitting in a middle seat, row 7, between a teacher from Little Rock and a contractor from Pittsburgh. No one recognized her. The teacher was reading, the contractor was dozing. Somewhere over Missouri, the teacher turned to her and asked, "You live in D.C.?" Crockett smiled. "Sometimes I work there." The woman nodded. "It's loud over there," Crockett replied. "Too loud sometimes. But I try to speak for folks who don't have the mic." The teacher studied her a moment, then said, "Well, if you're fighting for people who can't afford first class, you're in the right row." They laughed softly. Nothing profound, nothing dramatic, but that moment meant more to Crockett than any headline, because that's who she was fighting for, not just the people who could donate or vote, but the ones stuck in economy, trying to keep their heads above water, wondering if anyone in D.C. even saw them. She wasn't perfect, she'd say so herself, but she wasn't afraid to tell the truth. And in a room full of performance, that was rare. That hearing didn't change the system overnight, but it reminded people loudly, publicly, that their stories mattered, that somebody saw them. And sometimes, that's the start. But before we close, there's one thing Crockett wanted everyone watching to remember. A week after the hearing, Representative Crockett stood outside a small community center in Lancaster, Texas. No cameras, no press, just folding chairs, a few clipboards, and a room full of people waiting to ask questions about rent assistance, code enforcement, and the possibility of a new housing pilot program. A man in his late 60s, wearing a faded Dallas Cowboys jacket and work boots, raised his hand near the end. He didn't ask about legislation. He didn't ask about funding. He just said, "Do they listen when you talk like that up there?" Crockett didn't answer right away. She looked at the man, then glanced around the room at all the others who'd probably wondered the same thing. "Not always," she said, "but I don't speak so they'll feel comfortable. I speak so y'all don't feel invisible." And that's what it came down to. The hearing wasn't about shaming Senator Vance or going viral. That wasn't the win. The win was the moment people heard something familiar in a place they never expected to be represented. A congresswoman talking like someone who'd stood in their shoes. Not pretending, not posturing, just telling the truth. People forget that politics isn't just about laws, it's about memory. It's about whose version of reality gets believed, whose pain is validated, whose resilience gets ignored. When Crockett told that story about eviction, or brought up Terry in Ohio, and Ronnie with his space heater, she wasn't performing, was putting lives on the record. She was saying, these people exist, their conditions aren't accidents, their poverty isn't a footnote. And whether you live in a brick apartment in South Dallas, or a trailer off a dirt road outside Athens, your life should matter equally, fully, no exceptions. That message struck a nerve, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, raw, even the kind of honesty that can't be softened with spin or buried in a press release. And the truth is, we need more of that, not just in Congress, but in every place where decisions are made. More people who aren't afraid to say, hey, this system is broken, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We also need to stop pretending that working-class pain is only legitimate when it fits into someone's narrative. There's no such thing as the right kind of struggle. Whether you grew up in a housing project or a rural hollow, you know what it means to do everything right and still come up short. And if you do, if any part of this story reminds you of yourself, your mother, your neighbor, or your childhood, then you already understand why that hearing mattered. Maybe you've never had a microphone. Maybe you've never walked into a marble building with cameras pointed at your face. But you've lived the parts that count. The late rent, the space heater, the knot in your stomach when you see a yellow envelope taped to your door. And maybe, just maybe, you've waited a long time to hear someone say those things out loud in a place that's usually too proud or too political to admit them. That's why stories like Crockett's matter, not because she said it best, but because she said what too many people still can't. So here's the ask. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Talk about it. Share it. Ask your representatives hard questions. Demand better, not just for your community, but for the people you've never met who are living through the same thing in another zip code. Representation isn't a brand, it's a responsibility. And every time someone like Crockett speaks up, it reminds the rest of us that truth still has a place at the table. If you believe that matters, never forget, your voice counts, even when they act like it doesn't.